All right, so welcome to Boundaries Aren't Mean.
Yeah, so welcome. Thank you for joining our first webinar. For some of you, you probably know us because you hopefully listen to our voices every Wednesday or someday after Wednesday that week with our podcast. But for those of you who don't, this is our I guess our first big webinar. We're going to start doing these monthly with different topics. So you can save the date for next month. We're going to do it March 24th, and I'll say that again at the end. But we just thought it'd be fun to each month hop on, look at a different topic. Sometimes it'll have to do with what we're talking about in the podcast and depending on what season, and sometimes it won't. And with this case, we wanted to do something with a theme of Valentine's Day and sort of what is actually self-care, self-love. And so we were brainstorming, and I was actually the one that thought of boundaries. And the reason I have to give myself a pat on the back for that one is because I hate boundaries and I don't like setting them, and I find it very stressful. And so I am tooting my own horn because they really are important. And so that is why we're here today. We're here to talk about why they're important and how they really aren't being mean. Our plan is to actually scroll down a little bit because we have a little agenda. I promise we're not going to be on like PowerPoints the whole time. In fact, we're going to get rid of this like very soon, but it doesn't hurt to have an agenda. So our plan is to just do this, talk about why boundaries aren't mean, talk about how boundaries are in fact an act of self-love. We are all for, bubble baths and all those other kinds of acts of self-love, massages and all that good stuff. But I think boundaries are an important thing to add to your self-love repertoire. How boundaries will actually help you set yourself free. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then, well, we only are planning on talking for about a half an hour, give or take. So we can't actually go too deep into everybody's, personal how to set a boundary. We do want to leave you with some maybe mantras that can help you help you as you go out into the world and maybe start the baby steps of practicing setting boundaries in your own life. And so that is our goal at the end, is if you either are already trying to set boundaries in your life, either with yourself or others, or maybe you're like, hey, what's a boundary? And you want a little support. Hopefully there's a mantra that either we give you, or maybe you have one that you want to share with others, but something will resonate. And then you can kind of take that with you as a little affirmation to repeat or a mantra to repeat to yourself to help you as you're practicing setting boundaries. So that is our plan. With that, I will probably stop sharing for now because we don't need to see this agenda the whole time. And we will go from there. Did I miss anything, Riley?
No, that was great. That was fantastic. So let's kind of dive into why we think, or why we know, I'm not even going to say we think, why we know that boundaries aren't mean, right? So I think a lot of people get caught up in this idea that boundaries are something that are punishment or discipline or some way in which we separate ourselves from other people. And that's natural, right? Even in the word boundary, you're talking about putting a path, like a fence around yourself and somebody else. But fences are meant to protect people as much as they are to actually, like keep people out, right? They're like, what's the saying? It's fences make great neighbors or something like that. I think there's like a saying like that, right? And there's a reason for that. And that is that boundaries are intended to help you set limits that are appropriate for yourself and that help you feel good about yourself and your life. And so boundaries are really not something that's mean. It's just we've been conditioned over, I don't know, generations, particularly as women, to think that we're not allowed to say no, or that we are not allowed to listen to our own intuition when it's telling us to say no. And so I think a lot of us get caught up in this idea that we're constantly, fighting against this theory that we're supposed to not be setting boundaries, or we're supposed to be pleasing everyone all the time, or things of that nature. And then of course we're going to talk about the flip side of that, which is something that I struggle with, which is setting boundaries that are far too high and moat-like and castle-like and things and things like that.
What's fun about this is that we have tend to have opposite boundary problems, which is that I have entered this world as about not setting boundaries. And Riley has entered this world of like very big, tall boundaries with like, I always picture like a dragon in front of it, right?
Yeah, for some reason I make like castle references when I talk about boundaries. I don't know why.
And I've always pictured, in my head, it was like, well, you need boundaries for people who aren't nice to you, right? So you need to have boundaries with like the bad people in your life. When the fact of the matter is you actually need boundaries with everyone, like good people. I don't mean, I don't want to split people up in like good people versus bad people, because that's a little basic, but like people who you love and you want to spend all your time with because they're fantastic. And then also people who you're like, I don't really like you that much, but your family, so I see you during the holidays kind of people. Like you need boundaries with all of those people, because you're not going to be able to maintain those good relationships. They don't stay good without the boundaries. And I didn't realize that for a really, really, really long time. I also didn't realize that my dearest, closest, probably longest friend, we just by dumb luck, we didn't really know what we were doing. We actually set boundaries in our friendship. I don't know why. Just kind of fell into it when we were like 11 years old. We kind of said, okay, if we're ever mad at each other, we'll tell each other. And we're like, okay. And I don't know if it was just watching people in our lives like not doing that. Like, I don't know what made us do it, because we certainly hadn't had that experience that we should be doing that. But I mean, we're still best friends. Something clicked that like, okay, we better do this. And that's probably like the healthiest relationship I've ever had is with her. But like, it's this concept that you do have to just sort of make sure you draw those lines, and it's what lets you have the healthy relationship stay healthy. But for so long, I was so worried that if I were to draw a boundary, like, and often that means saying no, right? And saying I can't, or no, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. It would mean that, that person would think that I wasn't reliable, or that person would think that I didn't like them, or that person would think that they couldn't count on me, or I've let them down, or like all of these other things. And, most of which probably weren't true. But in my head, I had all of these horrible thoughts that were taking place if I were to say no. And so I just never said no. And that seemed like a really fantastic solution, except it was horrible. But it seemed like a great idea at the time, because I didn't want to be mean.
Yeah, you didn't want to be mean to the other people, right? And
right.
So, and a lot of that fear is based in a fear of judgment, and then also feelings of shame, which we talk about a lot on the podcast, and we talk about in our, on our blogs and things like that. But so much of our reactions to things are based in that sort of fear of being judged and fear of how people will react to us reacting. And so when we take a step back and we look at what it is we're actually drawing a boundary around, and what sort of things we're actually making decisions about and choices around, and if we stop and look at that and make the decision based on what it is that we really want versus what it is that we think other people are expecting of us, or what it is that we think we're expecting of us, right? Because boundaries, as we're about to get into, boundaries are for ourselves as well. And more importantly, boundaries are most often about us. They're far more frequently about us than they are about other people. Then we can start to look at boundaries as if they are more about self-preservation, about taking care of, they're about self-care, they're about actual self-care, not just, going online shopping and like, which I fully endorse and do plenty of, but like, they're the kind of self-care that is more in depth, right? They're the kind of self-care that is long-term versus like I need a break and I want to go, binge watch a show on Netflix and check out for a little bit. This is the kind of long-term self-care that really lifts you up and creates long-term change for you. But I think we might need to take just one little step back and talk about, what does a boundary really look like? Like technically, what does it look like to set a boundary? And Tova, you did this sort of when you were talking about your friendship, and it's really setting like actual terms around what you're willing to do and how you treat yourself. I mean, boundaries can look very different for different people, and they can be set around physical things. I mean, I think probably a lot of you guys have kids, and you've probably talked to your kids about their bodies, and you can set boundaries around your body, like, this is my body, you can't touch it, it's mine. But boundaries can also be energetic. You can set energetic boundaries, like, I'm not going to take on your emotional baggage. I'll listen to you, but your emotions are yours and mine are mine. My daughter talks a lot about, she has a description for it where sometimes two colors of Play-Doh get mixed together and you can't get them apart. And that's the way she describes the meshing of energetic boundaries, which I think is just genius. I'd never heard it described that way before, and it was a really, really smart way of describing it. And that's exactly what happens when energy overlaps, right? The Play-Doh colors get mixed together and it's really hard to get them apart. And then there's all kinds of other boundaries. There are familial boundaries, which if you have nosy in-laws or you have difficult family relationships of any kind, you have experienced those sorts of overlaps that are very difficult. And setting boundaries within family structures is a whole other area of boundaries. I don't know, what else am I forgetting, Tova, for boundaries?
Well, there's work boundaries.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So those are super hard to set.
Yep.
I think something that is important to remember is that especially with family, is that if you haven't set boundaries, like if you're not a boundary setter, like I will talk about me, like I'm not a boundary setter. I am now. I'm not going to say I'm not anymore.
Yeah,
I am a boundary setter.
You are now.
But like, maybe it's something that you haven't set expectations for your family to, whether it's like help around the house, do something around the house, or whether it's like you've just taken it all on, or whatever it is, whatever it just something is. And it could be at work or it could be at home or whatever it is. I think that sometimes it can be so overwhelming because that like, you can't just be like, okay, everyone, well, like my son last night, we always had a rule that like at a certain time, the kitchen closes. And then as time went on, that rule kind of got like a little shiftier. And now we're like back to that rule. And my 5-year-old last night was like, oh, I remember we had that rule. And then we didn't have that rule. And now we have that rule again. But like, I was like, yeah, okay, just roll with it. Like the rule's back. Like, so, but I think the point is that, it's hard because you do have to like keep enforcing the boundary. But the fact is that I think sometimes we think it's harder to enforce than it will be. And there are certainly boundaries that in certain relationships that are harder to enforce. And there's probably boundaries that we could have conversations that are unsafe to enforce. And we're not talking about those, but like if there's boundaries with your family where you just haven't set those expectations, yes, you don't say no one time or you don't say yes one time, you have to do it a few times, but they're often not as bad as you think they will be. And they're not as scary as you think they'll be. It's a matter of like setting those expectations and then reminding yourself that you deserve to have those expectations set. Like you deserve that boundary. You deserve to, whether it's having the kitchen closed at a certain time or having that time set, or you deserve to have the timeout for yourself. Like I know during the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was home and we didn't go anywhere, like I gave my time out. I gave myself timeouts, and we all gave ourselves, we had a behavior chart, and I had a behavior chart too. And I got gold on the number of timeouts I took for myself. Like I needed to take 2 or 3 timeouts a day. And so my kids actually reminded me to take timeouts because I needed to go to my room by myself. And so whatever it is, I think that sometimes boundaries can be scarier than they need to be. Sometimes they're legitimate scary, but sometimes they're scarier than they need to be because we just know that we're going to have to enforce them a couple of times.
Yeah, or we're anticipating a reaction, and the anticipation is often worse than the actual reaction is, right? Like the buildup is worse than something happening.
And I will say, and I always hate to say this, and I know not everyone on the call is moms, but there are some moms on the call, and I always want to be like, you'll do it for yourself. But you know, if you don't do it for yourself, do it for your kids. And I say this because, you know, I had a conversation with my son recently where he has a good friend, but he realized that he can't have play dates with his friend, like super long play dates. There just comes a point where like they just can't spend more time together. And he and I talked about it a little, and he's like, well, I just feel so bad. And I said, okay, but here are your 2 options. Like at this point, either you're going to just you're just going to stop hanging out with him, or you're just going to have shorter play dates. Like, I feel like one is kind of not cool because you like this kid and you either just like don't hang out with him anymore, which feels like the actual mean thing to do, or you just say that you can't, you know, maybe we make something up, right? And we say, okay, well, you know, I can only hang out for 2 hours, but you know, then you'll enjoy it the whole time. You'll have fun the whole time. That's a boundary that you're setting, but it's keeping your friendship happy. And so that's not actually mean. And we had to talk it through, and he was like, oh, okay. So kids can actually, I think, benefit, like they can actually get some of these sometimes easier than we can. But I want to move on to the self-love concept. And it hit me, you know, the anti-boundary person, it hit me at a particularly stressful weekend that Riley and I had when we were launching our podcast. And it was a weekend, I think it was the weekend that we launched the podcast. It was also the weekend that we set a boundary for ourselves, which was we will never launch anything a weekend that Tova has the kids. That is a boundary we have set. That the day after a weekend Tova has the kids will never be a day that we ever set, like we will never do this ever again. But because I had really worked, and because we had worked in our relationship and didn't know each other still very well at that time, we'd not really known each other a year at that point.
Yeah.
Because I had worked on setting boundaries, we had figured each other out enough. And I knew enough that like, if she would say, no, I can't do that, or no, that it didn't have anything to do with me personally, because I was actually saying no to people. And because I had started saying no to people or saying, no, I can't do that. And I knew that it didn't have anything to do with them personally. I was actually able to hear someone say no to me and not take it personally. And that was like a huge relief. So like setting a boundary is like it's such a relief, and it's a relief in a couple ways. So it's a relief in the way that you can actually have someone set a boundary for you and you're like, okay, cool. They said no. They're probably busy. No big deal. Like not like, oh my God, they don't like me anymore. They don't want to spend time with me, which is what I in the past would have thought. Like they don't want to start a business with me. They hate me, whatever. Like I would have spiraled instead of just like, okay, she's busy. Cool, whatever. But the other belief is, if you are the type of person that struggles with making a decision, right? And on one side is what you want to do, and on the other side is what you think you should do because somebody else wants you to do it, or society wants you to do it, or whatever, just for whatever reason you think you should do it. You don't really want to do it. And it's not like you should do it because, like, horrible things will happen if you don't do it. It's not like a morality thing. It's just like, you should do it. When you say no or yes, but when you set that boundary, it can be such a relief. And like, it can feel better than like a full body massage to like have like your heart unclench and your like shoulders lower. I mean, it feels so good. So at least for me, boundaries feel like an act of self-love, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And it allows you the time and the space to focus on the things that are actually important to you. And it allows you to not spend your time wondering and worrying about things that are not necessarily real, which I mean, sounds a little silly, but I think a lot of people spend a lot of time wondering what other people are thinking and wondering and worrying what other people might think about them. And if you're setting very clear boundaries for your life and clear boundaries about who you are and what you're willing to do and what you're willing to bring to the table, then you are not spending all your time worrying about what other people think about you and what other people might wonder about you, because you're just putting it out there. You're saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and you know, you can take it or leave it. And I know that probably sounds a little harsh, but it is also extraordinarily freeing to be able to put yourself out there like that. And it's not saying that you do that in a mean way or in a way that is tactless or aggressive. It's just, being able to say no to things or yes to things that you had been saying no to. Those, saying yes is also setting a boundary. It really depends on the circumstance. And so being able to communicate and be clear and make decisions and choices based on your own intentions versus, whatever the outside world might be pushing on you, I think is the way I would describe it, is, as Tova said, very freeing and can allow you sort of to release some of that weight of the expectations of the world from your shoulders. And that's a wonderful feeling, and certainly something that I would call an act of self-love, and something that we want to share with people because it's made our lives better. And that's one of our goals with our company, and one of the goals that we have through our coaching and what we do for people, and what we want to share with people. So, on the flip side of having these sort of porous boundaries is having super rigid boundaries. So I do want to touch on that a little bit. And that's something that people don't talk about as much, because I think, it's not as obvious necessarily, because I don't know, it just isn't. But you can have sort of the flip side of these super porous or kind of what Tova's describing of boundaries that don't sort of hold up as well. And those are rigid boundaries. And that's sort of something that I've struggled with personally most of my life. And those are boundaries where I just say no all the time to everything, and sort of just push things away. And that is it's kind of like the opposite but equal, right? And it it has the same result. It's just done in the opposite way, right? So you set these very rigid boundaries where no one can get in, and no one is allowed to penetrate the boundary at all. And that in and of itself makes you sort of isolated and alone. And that's no fun either. So, you might have rigid boundaries if you don't ask people for help ever. and people, like, if people tell you you seem detached a lot, but you don't feel detached, but that you seem detached. I know I was called a snob a lot growing up, which I was not a snob. I'm still not a snob, except maybe about like wine and cheese, uh, which, who isn't? Um, but these kinds of things, and it's a consequence of, part of my life, and something I've worked hard to get over and overcome, I should say. And it's it's a part. People do this for the same reason that people have very porous boundaries, and it's fear, right? It's the fear of rejection. It's the fear of how people will react if you put yourself out there, if you say what it is that you really want, or that you really think, or how you really feel. And so all of it comes down to the same sort of end result of setting boundaries is about taking a risk and making sure that you are able to hear that inner voice and understand yourself. And we've talked about this in multiple other settings, so you can find it in other places, but it's about understanding who you are and being able to hear that inner self and understand that and trust yourself enough to set boundaries that um, are something you're comfortable with and feel strong in, and trust that whatever comes out of that is going to be okay. And we know that people can do that, obviously, because Tova and I do it all the time now.
We try.
Tova's doing it.
We do it. We
It
do.
comes,
We try.
for whatever reason, this particular habit comes more naturally for me. But other things come more naturally for you, Tova. So it is what it is. We're getting there. But it's something that you can work on over time. And one of the things that helps us are these mantras that we use, and we've compiled a bunch of them. We'd love to share some of them with you, but we'd also love for you guys to share with us if there's anything that you use in your life that is like a mantra, or if there's any kind of phrase or any sort of oh my, like, I lost my sense of balance for a second when you shared your screen.
Sorry.
I was like, wow, what happened? But if there's anything that you guys use in your life that helps you set boundaries, or anything you would like to share, we would love to hear about it. You can drop it in the chat if you want, if you don't feel like or saying it out loud, or you can raise a hand if you want. Whatever is more comfortable, or if not, we can just sort of Tova can share some of these. You put some up on the screen, but if you want to read them, Tova, whatever you feel like.
Yeah, well, so here's a few. And so this was kicked off. I found a bunch of them, but it was actually kicked off. Brene Brown had like a Twitter question, and she kicked it off with the choose discomfort over resentment. And obviously, like, you find one that is your favorite. I think a lot of these would be great ones to have like on a sticky note at your work computer, like as a good one to kind of like slow you down when you're panicking or something, to respond to somebody, is to help set that work boundary. I saw some other ones. One said, my space is full, which I kind of don't really understand what it means, but I also really like it.
I feel that way about several mantras.
Yeah. I like one that says, you are not responsible for the happiness of others. So you say, I'm not responsible for the happiness of others. That's a good one that spoke to me. I think there's this concept of, you have to figure out what happens if you don't set the boundary. And obviously a lot of these focus on, what happens next. So does it lead to resentment, right? Because is it leading to you being too busy? Is it leading to resentment? And so this one, that I think the assumption in some of these cases is that it will lead to resentment. So resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die, which is a little harsh and intense, but
I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I've had several friendships falter because the friend repeatedly comes and brings sort of all of their stuff and just sort of leaves it on the table and refuses to pick up any of the other stuff on the table, if that makes sense. If that's like a bad metaphor, I'm sorry. But, they just, it's a one sided friendship, and that becomes exhausting over time. And if you're not setting any boundaries in that friendship, and it's your responsibility to set the boundary. And if you're not ever setting the boundary in that friendship, and it's over and over and over again, it's going to lead to resentment, and it's going to negatively impact the friendship. And so, as the person who needs to set the boundary and the person who's feeling resentful, it generally leads to either like a failure of the friendship, or you wind up having to have some very hard conversations, which, as I've matured over 40 years or so, I've learned how to, grow into. But certainly, as in my younger years, I found myself in that situation far too many times, and I wish I had understood. I don't know what the mantra was that you just read, but that mantra, back when I was younger, because that came up.
Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Right. I wish I had understood
Yes.
that back.
But there's another one, because you mentioned many times, and I think it's important. And I often think of the book The Year of Yes, about like setting those really hard boundaries that prevent you from experiencing your life. But here's one that says, it's a little no for the sake of a bigger yes, right? So oftentimes, if you have decided that you're going to stop saying, you're going to say no to all of these things that you're constantly saying yes to, because what you're doing is you're saying yes to spending more time with your family, or yes to spending more time with yourself. And I just saw somebody talk about splitting their to-do lists up into what things you want to do, things you have to do, and then things other people want you to do.
Yeah, I really like that.
Right. And then like the thing other people want you to do, sort of, not worry about as much.
Right.
Or not worry about it all. So, there's different ways to set boundaries. So we are over time, but we wanted to, give you some of these. We send out a newsletter 2-ish times a week. And we're going to compile a list. If you have any that you want to send us, you can send us a message afterwards. Here are all the places that you can find us. We are at all of these places. If you go to our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. So we are going to put a bunch of these mantras together. Like I said, we would love to have a 4-hour session with everybody, and we could hear all of your deep, dark boundary setting woes, and then we could share all of our deep, dark boundary setting woes. But we probably all want to either have dinner if you're on the West Coast, or go to sleep if you're on the East Coast.
Yeah.
But or maybe not go to sleep. But Riley and I probably should have set a boundary, because I was in a meeting all day and Riley's been sick for 2 days. So a good boundary would have been to reschedule. She wants to go to sleep at the very least. But you can go to goboldlyinitiative.com and sign up for the newsletter. It's like all over the place to sign up. And so the next newsletter we send out will be with just a ton of different mantras. And I will just tell you that when COVID sort of pushed me, the very beginning of COVID, like when we were all like hardcore lockdown, really pushed me to start setting boundaries, because, I had to kind of tell the grandparents, like, okay, you can't tell my kids we're going to see you in 2 weeks, because like we're not. And I can't have them get excited every time they talk to you on the phone. I know you, and also you can't be like, whenever your mom lets me, like, it's not fair to me. And that was like my baby boundary. And that's how I started looking at it. And my therapist did tell me, like, so these are actually big boundaries. They're not baby boundaries. But it was much easier for me to start thinking of things as like baby. I was like, no, I'm just setting little baby boundaries. And she's like, okay, whatever. They're big boundaries, but whatever. But it was a lot easier for me to approach things as if they were these like little baby boundaries. So, if you're not used to them, just little tiny no's, little tiny yeses, go for it. Grab a mantra that talks, speaks to you and put it on a sticky note, put it in your bathroom mirror. I have random inspirational quotes all over my house.
Yeah,
Sticky
I
notes.
put them up all over the house. So
Yeah. The kids see them, they like them. Sometimes they don't, and they're like, my mom's crazy, but sometimes they like them. So we actually, speaking of which, we have some ones that you can get for if you give us your email for the newsletter, then they're on our website. You can have those too around your house. But I think that's about it. So thank you for joining us. We will be sharing a recording of this sometime soon, and we'll share our next webinar when we're inspired as to what the topic is going to be. We did do a full podcast on boundaries. I want to say it was season 2, episode 6. So if you've never listened to the podcast and you're like, I don't want to listen to 58 episodes, that's fine. But season 2, episode 6 was on boundaries. So if you want to hear us kind of dive into like deeper definitions and a lot more into the whys and the hows, that's about it. So thank you for joining us and have a great evening, everyone.
thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. That was great.
Thanks, Morgan. You want to stop the recording?